The sound of 3 sharp knocks on the apartment door at 7:30 a.m. made Simone Carter's blood run cold. She had been braiding 8-year-old Ruby's hair for school when the knocking started, not the gentle rap of a neighbor or the familiar rhythm of the mailman, but the kind of authoritative pounding that meant trouble. Through the peephole, she saw a stern white woman in a gray suit holding a clipboard, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. "Mrs. Carter? I'm Mrs. Henderson from Child Protective Services. We need to speak with you immediately." Simone's hands trembled as she unlocked the door, her mind racing through every possible reason for this visit. The small apartment was clean, the girls were fed and dressed for school, and she had worked double shifts all week to make sure the rent was paid. What could possibly be wrong? "Mama, who is it?" Ruby whispered, her dark eyes wide with concern as she peered around her mother's legs. 5-year-old Jasmine clung to her favorite stuffed elephant, sensing the tension in the room even though she didn't understand what was happening. Mrs. Henderson stepped into the small living room without invitation, her cold blue eyes scanning every corner like a detective at a crime scene. She made notes on her clipboard as she observed the mismatched furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, and the girls' toys scattered across the worn carpet. "We've received reports about the living conditions here," Mrs. Henderson announced, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Anonymous tips about neglect, inadequate supervision, and unsafe housing conditions." Simone felt the world spinning around her. "Reports? What reports? My children are well taken care of. I work 2 jobs to provide for them. They're healthy, they're loved, they're—" "Ma'am, I need you to remain calm," one of the officers interrupted. "We're here to assess the situation and ensure the children's welfare." Ruby stepped forward, her small chin lifted defiantly. "My mama takes good care of us. She makes us breakfast every morning and reads us stories at night. She works really hard." Mrs. Henderson barely glanced at the child before continuing her inspection. She opened the refrigerator, which contained the basics: milk, eggs, bread, some leftover chicken from Sunday dinner, and juice boxes for the girls' lunches. It wasn't full, but it wasn't empty either. She checked the bathroom, noting the shared toothbrushes and the small bottles of generic shampoo. "The girls share a bedroom," Mrs. Henderson observed, making another note. "No separate beds." "They have bunk beds," Simone explained desperately. "Ruby has the top bunk, Jasmine has the bottom. They like sharing a room. They're sisters." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't listening to explanations. She was building a case, checking boxes on forms that would determine whether this small family stayed together or was torn apart forever. In the bedroom, she photographed everything: the carefully folded clothes in the shared dresser, the handmade bookshelf Simone had built from crates, the small collection of library books they read together every night. What Simone saw as a loving home created through sacrifice and determination, Mrs. Henderson documented as evidence of poverty and inadequate living conditions. "Mrs. Carter, I'm going to need to conduct individual interviews with both children," she announced, returning to the living room. "Officers, please escort the mother to the kitchen while I speak with the girls privately." "No." Simone's voice cracked with panic. "You can't separate me from my children. They don't understand what's happening. Please just tell me what this is about. Who made these reports?" "The source of the reports is confidential," Mrs. Henderson replied coldly. "But the allegations are serious enough to warrant immediate intervention." As the officers gently but firmly guided Simone away from her daughters, she could hear Ruby's voice getting smaller and more frightened. Jasmine began to cry, calling for her mama, but Mrs. Henderson closed the bedroom door, shutting out the sound. For the next 30 minutes, Simone sat at her own kitchen table feeling like a prisoner in her own home. She could hear muffled voices from the bedroom but couldn't make out the words. Every few minutes, one of her daughters would cry, and the sound cut through her heart like glass. When Mrs. Henderson finally emerged, her expression was grim. "Mrs. Carter, based on my preliminary assessment and the children's statements, I have concerns about their safety and well-being in this environment." "What did they say?" Simone stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "My children love me. I would never hurt them." "Physical harm isn't the only form of abuse," Mrs. Henderson replied. "Neglect comes in many forms: inadequate housing, lack of supervision, emotional instability." Simone felt like she was drowning. "Emotional instability? I'm working 2 jobs to keep us together. I'm stressed, yes, but I'm not unstable. Everything I do is for them." Mrs. Henderson handed her a thick packet of papers. "These are temporary custody documents. The children will be placed in emergency foster care while we conduct a full investigation." The words hit Simone like a physical blow. Foster care. The system she had fought so hard to avoid, the nightmare that had haunted her own childhood. She thought of her daughters. Confused faces, of Ruby's fierce loyalty and Jasmine's quiet trust, and something inside her shattered. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't take my babies. They're all I have. I can fix whatever's wrong. Just tell me what to do." But Mrs. Henderson was already calling for backup. Within minutes, 2 more social workers arrived with car seats and paperwork. Ruby ran to her mother, wrapping her arms around Simone's waist. "Mama, I don't want to go. I want to stay with you." Jasmine was crying so hard she could barely breathe, her small body shaking with fear and confusion. "Mama, make them go away. I want to go to school. I want to come home." Simone knelt down and pulled both girls into her arms, memorizing the feel of their small bodies, the smell of Ruby's freshly braided hair, the way Jasmine's tears felt warm against her neck. She had to be strong for them, even though her own heart was breaking into a million pieces. "Listen to me," she whispered urgently. "No matter what happens, no matter where you go, remember that Mama loves you more than anything in the whole world. You are brave, beautiful, smart girls, and this is not your fault. None of this is your fault." "Mrs. Carter, we need to go," one of the social workers said gently but firmly. As they pulled her daughters away from her, Simone felt a part of her soul being ripped out. Ruby looked back over the social worker's shoulder, her eyes filled with tears and confusion. "Mama, I'll be good. I promise I'll be really good, so they'll bring us back." The door closed with a finality that echoed through the suddenly empty apartment. Simone collapsed onto the floor, surrounded by her daughter's toys and the lingering scent of the breakfast she had made them just an hour before. In the space of 90 minutes, her entire world had been destroyed by anonymous accusations and a system that saw poverty as a crime and struggle as failure. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a fight that would test every ounce of strength she had, challenge everything she believed about justice and family, and ultimately depend on the courage of an 8-year-old girl who refused to let the truth be buried under paperwork and prejudice. The emergency foster home was a large house in a suburb that felt like a different planet from the close-knit apartment complex where Ruby and Jasmine had grown up. Mrs. Patterson, their temporary foster mother, was a kind enough woman in her 50s who had been taking in children for over a decade. She showed them to a bedroom with 2 single beds, each covered with a floral bedspread that smelled like fabric softener instead of home. "The rules are simple," Mrs. Patterson explained as Ruby held Jasmine's hand tightly. "Lights out at 8, no running in the house, and you'll be attending Lincoln Elementary starting tomorrow." Ruby's heart sank. Lincoln Elementary was across town from her real school, where Ms. Davis knew that she loved to read chapter books and where her friend Destiny saved her a seat at lunch every day. Everything familiar was being stripped away piece by piece. That first night, Jasmine cried herself to sleep while Ruby lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what had happened. She replayed every moment of that terrible morning, searching for clues about why those people thought their mama wasn't taking care of them properly. Meanwhile, across town in the apartment that now felt enormous in its emptiness, Simone was experiencing her own nightmare. The legal aid attorney assigned to her case was a tired-looking man named Mr. Jackson who seemed to have too many files and not enough time. "Mrs. Carter, I'll be honest with you," he said during their first meeting in his cluttered office. "CPS cases are difficult to fight, especially when you're dealing with allegations of neglect. The burden of proof is on you to show that you can provide a safe, stable environment." Simone's hands shook as she read through the official report Mrs. Henderson had filed. According to the document, their apartment was overcrowded and inadequately furnished, the children showed signs of emotional distress, and Simone herself appeared overwhelmed and unable to cope with the demands of single parenthood. "But none of that is true," Simone protested. "My children were happy. We had routines, we had love, we had everything that mattered." Mr. Jackson looked at her with tired eyes. "The system doesn't always see love as enough. You'll need to complete parenting classes, undergo psychological evaluation, find better housing, and demonstrate financial stability. Even then, there are no guarantees." At school, Ruby tried to blend in, but everything felt wrong. The other kids had different clothes, different lunches, different ways of talking. When the teacher asked students to share what they did over the weekend, Ruby stayed silent. How could she explain that she spent Saturday calling her mama from Mrs. Patterson's phone, crying because she didn't know when she'd see her again? The visits were the worst part. Once a week, for exactly 2 hours, Ruby and Jasmine were allowed to see their mother in a sterile room at the CPS office. A supervisor sat in the corner taking notes while they tried to pretend everything was normal. Simone would bring coloring books and try to smile, but Ruby could see the sadness in her eyes and the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. "How's school, baby?" Simone asked during their third visit, stroking Ruby's hair. "It's okay," Ruby lied. She didn't want to tell her mama about the kids who whispered about foster children, or how she had to explain to the teacher why she didn't have the same last name as her emergency contact, or how she lay awake every night missing the sound of their old apartment building settling into sleep. Jasmine mostly sat quietly during these visits, coloring with fierce concentration. At 5, she couldn't fully understand what was happening, but she felt the weight of the adults' sadness and confusion. Sometimes she would ask when they were going home, and the supervisor would make a note on her clipboard, as if a little girl's longing for her mother was evidence of something suspicious. Back in the apartment, Simone was following every requirement the system had set for her. She attended parenting classes where she learned about childhood development stages she already knew by heart from raising her own children. She submitted to psychological evaluations where strangers asked her about her childhood, her relationships, her fears and dreams, all to determine if she was worthy of loving her own daughters. The hardest part was the housing requirement. Her current apartment was deemed too small for 3 people, but finding a bigger place required more money than she could make even working 2 jobs. It was an impossible circle. She needed her children back to feel motivated to build a better life, but she couldn't get her children back until she had already built that better life on her own. Grandma Rose, Simone's mother, became her lifeline during these dark weeks. A retired elementary school teacher with a fierce protective streak, she had raised 5 children of her own and wasn't about to let her granddaughters disappear into the system without a fight. "Baby girl," she told Simone one evening as they sat in the empty apartment, "I've seen this before. The system is set up to help families, but sometimes it hurts them instead. You can't give up. Those girls need you to fight." "I am fighting, Mama," Simone replied, exhaustion evident in every word. "I'm doing everything they asked. But what if it's not enough? What if they decide I'm not good enough to be their mother?" Grandma Rose took her daughter's hands in her own weathered ones. "You listen to me. You're a good mother. You're working yourself to the bone to provide for those girls and they know it. Ruby especially, that child sees everything. She knows who loves her and who's just doing a job." At Lincoln Elementary, Ruby was indeed seeing everything. She noticed how the other foster kids in her class seemed resigned to their situation, how they didn't talk about going home because home was just a word that had lost its meaning. She watched Mrs. Patterson interact with the social workers who came to check on them, noting how different her foster mother acted when the officials were around versus when they were alone. Most importantly, Ruby was listening. During the adult conversations that happened around her, the phone calls Mrs. Patterson made to report on their adjustment, the discussions between social workers about their case, the casual comments made by school staff, Ruby was gathering information like a detective building a case. She learned that their removal had been based on an anonymous tip called in to the CPS hotline. Someone had reported that Simone was leaving the children alone, that they were often hungry, and that the living conditions were unsafe. Ruby knew these claims were lies, but she also began to understand that the truth wasn't always enough in the adult world. Sometimes she realized with 8-year-old wisdom that was both heartbreaking and remarkable, you had to be smart about how you told the truth. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the children had been removed. Simone would have her chance to present evidence that she was a fit mother, and the judge would decide whether the girls could come home or if the case would proceed to a full trial that could take months or even years to resolve. As that crucial date approached, Ruby made a decision that would change everything. She asked Mrs. Patterson if she could write a letter to the judge. It was an unusual request, but Mrs. Patterson, who had grown fond of the articulate little girl, agreed to help her send it. What Ruby wrote in that letter, in her careful third-grade handwriting, was about to expose the truth that the adults had missed and reveal a story that would shock everyone involved in their case. The 8-year-old who had been seen as just another victim of unfortunate circumstances was about to prove that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful truths. Ruby spent 3 days writing her letter to the judge, carefully choosing each word like her mama had taught her when they worked on her school essays together. She wrote it during quiet time at Mrs. Patterson's house, when Jasmine was napping and the adults thought she was reading. But this was more important than any book she'd ever read. The letter began simply, "Dear Judge, my name is Ruby Carter and I am 8 years old. I want to tell you the truth about my mama because I think someone told you lies." In her neat handwriting, Ruby described their real life, not the story Mrs. Henderson had written in her report, but the actual truth of their days together. She wrote about how her mama woke up at 5 a.m. to get ready for her first job at the hospital cafeteria, but always made sure to braid Ruby's hair and pack their lunches before she left. She described how Grandma Rose came over every day after school to watch them until Simone got home from her second job at the grocery store. Mrs. Henderson said we don't have enough food, but that's not true, Ruby wrote. Mama always makes sure we eat first, even when she's not hungry. She taught me to make sandwiches so I can help take care of Jasmine. We have mac and cheese and chicken and vegetables from the store where Mama works. Sometimes we have pancakes for dinner because that's fun, and Mama says breakfast food can be eaten anytime. The letter went on to detail their evening routines, their weekend trips to the library, the way Simone helped with homework even when she was exhausted from working 14-hour days. Ruby wrote about their apartment not as the inadequate housing described in the CPS report, but as the home where they had built a life together. Our apartment is small, but it's clean and safe, she continued. I know because Mama taught me about safety. She showed me how to lock the door and not answer it unless I know who it is. She taught me Grandma Rose's phone number and our address and what to do if there's ever an emergency. Mama never left us alone. Never. Grandma Rose was always there when Mama was working. But the most important part of Ruby's letter was what she had discovered about who had made the reports against her mother. During her time at Mrs. Patterson's house, Ruby had overheard a phone conversation that revealed the truth. I need to tell you something very important, she wrote. Mrs. Henderson told Mama that someone called to report that we were being neglected. I heard Mrs. Patterson talking on the phone to someone about our case. She didn't know I was listening, but I heard her say that the reports came from Mrs. Franklin, who lives in our building. Mrs. Franklin was the building manager, a bitter woman who had been trying to get them evicted for months. Ruby remembered the arguments between Mrs. Franklin and her mother about late rent payments, remembered how the woman's face would twist with anger whenever she saw the Carter family in the hallway. Mrs. Franklin doesn't like us because sometimes Mama is late with the rent when she has to buy our medicine, or when Jasmine was sick and Mama had to miss work to take care of her, Ruby continued in her letter. Mrs. Franklin told Mama she was going to make us move. I think she called CPS to make us leave because she knew it would hurt us the most. The 8-year-old had unknowingly uncovered what the trained social workers had missed, that the anonymous reports were not from a concerned neighbor looking out for children's welfare, but from a vindictive building manager using the system as a weapon to solve a rental dispute. Ruby's letter concluded with a plea that was both heartbreaking and powerful in its simplicity. Judge, I know you probably think kids don't know about important things, but I know my Mama loves us. I know she takes good care of us. I know we belong together. Please let us go home. Please don't let Mrs. Franklin win. Please let our family be a family again. When Mrs. Patterson found the letter, she was initially hesitant to send it. Foster parents weren't supposed to get involved in custody decisions. But something about Ruby's careful words and obvious pain touched her heart. She had seen hundreds of children pass through her home, and she recognized the difference between a child who had been truly neglected and one who had simply been poor. 3 days before the hearing, Mrs. Patterson made copies of Ruby's letter and sent them to the judge, to Mr. Jackson, and to Mrs. Henderson. She also made a phone call to the CPS office that would later prove crucial to the case. I think you need to investigate the source of the original reports, she told Mrs. Henderson. This child has made some serious allegations about the building manager, and after 3 weeks of observation, I can tell you that these girls show all the signs of children who have been well loved and properly cared for. Mrs. Henderson initially dismissed the concerns. 8-year-olds, she believed, couldn't possibly understand the complexities of child welfare cases. But Ruby's letter contained specific details that began to trouble the experienced social worker. How did the child know about the exact nature of the reports? How could she provide such detailed information about their daily routines and care arrangements? Reluctantly, Mrs. Henderson decided to investigate Mrs. Franklin. What she found made her stomach turn with shame and anger at her own assumptions. Mrs. Franklin had indeed made multiple calls to the CPS hotline over a 6-month period. But when Mrs. Henderson reviewed the call logs more carefully, she noticed that each report had been made within days of late rent payments. The building manager had even admitted to another tenant that she was going to find a way to get those people out of here, after Simone had requested repairs to their heater. More damaging still, Mrs. Henderson discovered that Mrs. Franklin had embellished and outright fabricated many of the details in her reports. She had claimed to witness the children being left alone when Grandma Rose's car was parked right outside the building. She had reported seeing the girls looking malnourished, on the same day that school records showed Ruby had brought extra snacks to share with a classmate whose lunch had been forgotten. As the truth began to emerge, Mrs. Henderson felt the weight of what she had done. She had removed 2 children from a loving home based on lies told by a woman with a personal vendetta. She had separated a family not because the children were in danger, but because she had failed to investigate the source of the accusations properly. The night before the hearing, Simone sat in her empty apartment surrounded by the evidence she had gathered to prove her fitness as a mother. She had certificates from parenting classes, letters from her employers praising her work ethic, documentation of her efforts to find better housing, and character references from neighbors, teachers, and family friends. But the most powerful piece of evidence would come from her 8-year-old daughter, who had done what trained professionals had failed to do. She had uncovered the truth and found the courage to speak it, even when the adults around her had forgotten to listen to what children know about their own lives. As Ruby lay in her bed at Mrs. Patterson's house that same night, she whispered a prayer to any force in the universe that might be listening. Tomorrow she thought she would see her mama in court. Tomorrow maybe they could finally go home. Neither mother nor daughter knew it yet, but Ruby's letter had started a chain of events that would not only reunite their family but would also lead to changes in how CPS investigated anonymous reports, ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the same injustice. Sometimes, the truth spoken by a child could shake the foundations of an entire system. The family courtroom felt enormous to Ruby as she walked in holding Mrs. Patterson's hand. She had never been in a place like this before, with its high ceiling, dark wood panels, and serious-faced adults in suits. But when she saw her mama sitting at a table with Mr. Jackson, Ruby's heart felt like it might explode with joy and sadness all at once. Simone turned when she heard the door open, and their eyes met across the room. In that moment, all the pain of the past 6 weeks seemed to crystallize into something almost unbearable. Ruby looked thinner than before, her clothes clearly borrowed from the foster home's donation box, but her eyes still held that fierce intelligence that made Simone so proud. Judge Patricia Brown was a distinguished African-American woman in her 50s who had been presiding over family court for over a decade. She had seen every kind of case imaginable, from truly horrific abuse situations to heartbreaking misunderstandings. As she reviewed the Carter file that morning, something had troubled her about the initial removal order. "Your Honor," Mr. Jackson began when Judge Brown called the case, "we're here today because a loving family has been torn apart based on false accusations. My client, Simone Carter, is a hard-working single mother who has never neglected or harmed her children in any way." Mrs. Henderson sat uncomfortably at the prosecution table, the weight of her mistake growing heavier with each passing hour. She had spent the weekend investigating Mrs. Franklin's claims more thoroughly and had discovered a pattern of lies that made her question everything about how she had handled this case. "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Brown said, "please present your evidence for the continued custody of the minor children." Standing slowly, Mrs. Henderson looked down at her notes and then up at the judge. What she said next shocked everyone in the courtroom. "Your Honor, after further investigation, I believe we made an error in this case. The reports that led to the emergency removal appear to have been fabricated by the children's building manager as retaliation for rental disputes." The courtroom fell silent. Mr. Jackson looked stunned. Simone gripped the edge of the table, afraid to hope. Judge Brown leaned forward. "Are you saying that CPS is withdrawing its petition?" "Not exactly, Your Honor. We still need to present all the evidence, but I want to acknowledge that our initial assessment was flawed." Mrs. Henderson's voice was steady, but Ruby could see her hands shaking. "I would like to call Ruby Carter to testify." Ruby's heart started pounding. She had hoped her letter would help, but she hadn't expected to have to speak in front of all these strangers. Mrs. Patterson squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Ruby, honey," Judge Brown said gently when Ruby was seated in the witness chair, "do you know why we're all here today?" "Yes, ma'am," Ruby replied, her voice small but clear. "Someone told lies about my mama, and now Jasmine and I can't go home. Can you tell me about your home life with your mother?" Ruby took a deep breath and began to speak. Her words came out in a rush at first, then steadied as she found her courage. She told the judge about their morning routines, about how Simone always made sure they had clean clothes and hot breakfast, about the way their mama would read to them every night even when she was tired from working. "Mrs. Henderson said our apartment was too small," Ruby continued, "but it never felt too small to us. Mama made it feel big by filling it with love. She taught us songs and games and let us build blanket forts in the living room on rainy days." Judge Brown listened carefully, noting how the child's testimony painted a completely different picture from the original CPS report. "Ruby, do you know who Mrs. Franklin is?" "Yes, ma'am. She's the mean lady who manages our building. She doesn't like kids and she especially doesn't like us." Ruby's voice got stronger as she talked about Mrs. Franklin. "She was always yelling at Mama about money, even when Mama explained about Jasmine being sick or when I needed new shoes for school. Did you ever hear Mrs. Franklin make any threats? Ruby nodded emphatically. She told Mama she was going to make us move away. She said she had ways to get rid of tenants who caused her problems. I didn't know what she meant then, but I think I do now. Mrs. Henderson stood up. Your Honor, I need to present additional evidence that supports Ruby's testimony. She handed the judge a thick folder containing Mrs. Franklin's call records to the CPS hotline, copies of eviction notices that had been filed and withdrawn, and statements from other tenants in the building who confirmed Mrs. Franklin's pattern of harassment. We also discovered that Mrs. Franklin has made similar false reports about other families in the building, Mrs. Henderson admitted. In each case, the reports coincided with rental disputes or requests for building repairs. Judge Brown's expression grew stern as she reviewed the evidence. Mrs. Henderson, are you telling me that CPS removed these children from their home without properly investigating the source of the accusations? Yes, Your Honor. I take full responsibility for that failure. The judge turned back to Ruby. Sweetheart, is there anything else you want to tell me about your mama? Ruby looked directly at Simone, her eyes filling with tears. My mama isn't perfect, but she's the best mama in the world for us. She works really hard to take care of us, and she never makes us feel like we're too much trouble. When I'm scared, she holds me. When Jasmine has bad dreams, Mama sings to her. She teaches us to be brave and kind and smart. Ruby's voice cracked, but she kept going. I know we don't have a lot of money, but Mama always finds a way to make us happy. She saves her tips from work to buy us books from the used bookstore. She makes up stories about princesses who look like us. She tells us we can be anything we want to be when we grow up. The 8-year-old wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Judge, Mama didn't do anything wrong except be poor. And being poor isn't the same as being a bad parent. Mama taught me that. She said some families have more money and some have less, but what matters is how much love they have. We have so much love. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom when Ruby finished speaking. Even Mrs. Henderson was wiping away tears, the full weight of what she had put this family through hitting her with devastating clarity. Judge Brown called for a brief recess, during which she reviewed all the evidence one more time. When court reconvened, her decision was swift and decisive. After reviewing all the evidence presented today, including the testimony of Ruby Carter and the investigation into the false reports made by Mrs. Franklin, this court finds that the emergency removal of these children was unwarranted and based on fabricated accusations. Simone gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Furthermore, Judge Brown continued, the evidence clearly shows that Simone Carter is a loving, dedicated mother who has been working tirelessly to provide for her children under difficult circumstances. The poverty that this family faces is not a crime, nor is it evidence of neglect. The judge looked directly at Simone. Mrs. Carter, your children are being returned to your custody immediately. CPS will provide support services to help your family access resources for housing and financial assistance, but these will be voluntary services, not mandated requirements. Ruby jumped up from her seat and ran to her mother, not caring about courtroom protocol. Simone caught her daughter in her arms, holding her so tightly that Ruby could barely breathe. But breathing didn't matter right then. Nothing mattered except the feeling of being in her mama's arms again. Mama, can we go home now? Ruby whispered. Yes, baby, Simone replied through her tears. We can go home. As the family embraced in the courtroom, Judge Brown made one final announcement that would ensure justice was truly served. But that revelation, and the changes it would bring not just to the Carter family but to the entire system that had failed them, would unfold in ways none of them could imagine. The ride home felt like a dream. Ruby sat pressed against her mother's side in Mr. Jackson's car, afraid that if she let go, this might all disappear. Jasmine hadn't stopped talking since they left the courthouse, chattering about everything she wanted to show Mama when they got home, as if the past 6 weeks had been nothing more than a bad sleepover. But when they walked into the apartment, the silence was deafening. The space that had once felt alive with their daily rhythms now seemed to echo with emptiness. Simone stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had all survived. It feels different, Ruby observed quietly, her 8-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Simone knelt down and pulled both girls close. It might feel different for a while, babies. We've all been through something hard. But we're together now, and that's what matters most. The first few days were a mixture of joy and adjustment. Ruby and Jasmine had to readjust to their old school, their old friends, their old routines. Some nights, Jasmine would wake up crying, forgetting where she was and calling for Mrs. Patterson. Ruby would have nightmares about social workers coming to take them away again. But Grandma Rose was there every day helping them rebuild their sense of security. She cooked their favorite meals, helped with homework, and most importantly, she listened when any of them needed to talk about what had happened. Trauma isn't just something that goes away overnight, she explained to Simone one evening as they watched the girls play. Y'all need time to heal, and that's okay. Healing isn't linear. A week after they returned home, Judge Brown made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the child welfare system. She had ordered a full investigation into Mrs. Franklin's false reports and had discovered that this was part of a larger pattern of abuse within the system. Mrs. Franklin was arrested for filing false reports and harassment. But more importantly, Judge Brown used the Carter case to implement new procedures for how CPS would handle anonymous tips in the future. Anonymous reports will now be investigated with the same rigor as any other accusation, she announced at a press conference. Social workers will be required to verify claims independently and document their investigations thoroughly before any child is removed from their home. Mrs. Henderson, to her credit, requested a transfer to training and quality assurance. I never want another family to go through what the Carters experienced, she told her supervisor. If I can help train other social workers to do better, then maybe something good can come from my mistake. 3 months later, the Carter family received news that would change their lives in an unexpected way. A local news station had covered their story, and the community response was overwhelming. A housing nonprofit reached out to offer Simone a rent-stabilized 2-bedroom apartment in a better neighborhood. A scholarship fund was established for Ruby and Jasmine's education. Most surprisingly, several job offers came in for Simone, including one at a community center where her experience could help other struggling families. Mama, why are all these people being so nice to us? Jasmine asked one day as they packed boxes in preparation for their move to the new apartment. Simone paused in her packing and thought about how to explain it. Sometimes, baby, when something bad happens to one family, it helps other people remember what's really important. People saw how much we love each other, and they wanted to help make sure we could stay together and be happy. Ruby looked up from the book she was carefully placing in a box. Like how when someone falls down on the playground, other kids come help them up? Exactly like that, Simone smiled. Sometimes grown-ups forget to help each other, but when they remember, beautiful things can happen. The new apartment was in a tree-lined neighborhood where children rode bikes on sidewalks and neighbors said hello to each other. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that let in morning sunshine, and a small backyard where the girls could play. But the best part, Ruby decided, was that it felt like home from the very first day. On moving day, an unexpected visitor arrived. Mrs. Patterson stood on their doorstep holding a casserole dish and wearing a nervous smile. I hope you don't mind me coming by, she said to Simone. I wanted to return something that belongs to Ruby. She handed Ruby a small notebook, the one where Ruby had written her first draft of the letter to the judge. Mrs. Patterson had kept it safe, knowing it might be important to the little girl who had been brave enough to speak truth to power. I also wanted to apologize, Mrs. Patterson continued, looking directly at Simone. I've been a foster parent for 12 years and I've seen a lot of children come and go. But your girls, they were different. They never stopped believing they belonged with you. I should have spoken up sooner about what I was seeing. Simone shook her head. You did speak up when it mattered. You made sure Ruby's letter got to the judge. You helped save our family. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. Those girls taught me something about the difference between a house and a home. I hope I remember that lesson with every child who comes to stay with me. 6 months later, Ruby was invited to speak at a conference for social workers and child advocates. At 9 years old, she was probably the youngest person ever to address such a gathering, but she had something important to say. Standing at the podium in her best dress, a bright blue one that Simone had saved up to buy for this special occasion, Ruby looked out at the room full of adults whose job it was to protect children. My name is Ruby Carter, she began, her voice clear and strong. Last year, someone told lies about my family, and because of those lies, my sister and I were taken away from our mama for 6 weeks. She paused, gathering her courage. I want to tell you something important. Kids know when they're loved. We know when we're safe. We know the difference between a mama who's doing her best and a mama who doesn't care. Sometimes grown-ups forget to ask us what we know about our own lives. The room was completely silent, hanging on every word from this remarkable child. My mama works really hard to take care of us. She's tired sometimes and worried sometimes, and yes, we don't have a lot of money. But she never made us feel like we were a burden. She never made us feel unloved. She taught us that families stick together, especially when times are hard. Ruby looked directly at several social workers in the front row. I know your job is to keep kids safe and that's really important. But sometimes being poor isn't the same as being unsafe. Sometimes struggling isn't the same as failing. Sometimes the best place for a kid is with their mama, even if their mama is still figuring things out. She concluded with words that would be quoted in training materials for years to come. Before you take kids away from their families, please listen to what the kids are saying. Really listen. We might be small but we know big things about love. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. Several social workers approached Ruby afterward to thank her and to promise they would remember her words in their work. A year after the custody battle, the Carter family had settled into their new life. Simone had taken the job at the community center, where she helped other single mothers navigate social services and access resources. Ruby was thriving in her new school, where her teachers recognized her natural leadership abilities and encouraged her interest in writing. Jasmine had made friends in the neighborhood and was learning to ride the bike that Grandma Rose had bought her for her 6th birthday. But perhaps the most important change was in how they talked about what had happened to them. Instead of seeing it as something shameful or traumatic, they had come to understand it as a test of their strength and love, a test they had passed with flying colors. One evening as they sat together reading in their living room, Jasmine looked up from her picture book and asked, "Mama, are you glad we went through all that scary stuff?" Simone considered the question carefully. "I'm not glad it happened, baby. It was scary and sad and we never should have been separated like that. But I'm proud of how we handled it. I'm proud of how Ruby was brave enough to tell the truth, and how you were strong even when you were scared, and how our family's love was bigger than anything that tried to break us apart." Ruby closed her chapter book and snuggled closer to her mother. "And now we help other families so it doesn't happen to them." "That's right," Simone agreed. "Sometimes the hardest things we go through teach us how to help other people." 2 years later, Ruby's letter to the judge had become part of a training program used in social work schools across the country. The Carter Protocol, as it came to be known, required child welfare workers to interview children separately about their experiences and to independently verify all anonymous reports before taking emergency action. Mrs. Franklin served 6 months in jail and was banned from working in property management. More importantly, her case led to legislation requiring background checks and training for anyone in positions of authority over families seeking housing assistance. On Ruby's 10th birthday, Judge Brown sent her a card with a special message. "Thank you for teaching us all that wisdom doesn't depend on age, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. Your courage saved not just your own family but countless others." The party was held in their backyard, with neighbors, friends from school and chosen family members like Mrs. Patterson and even Mrs. Henderson, who had become an advocate for reform within the child welfare system. As Ruby blew out her candles, she made a wish that all children who were separated from loving families would find their way home. Later that evening, as Simone tucked her daughters into their beds in the home they had fought so hard to rebuild, Ruby asked one final question. "Mama, do you think everything happens for a reason?" Simone smoothed her daughter's hair and considered her answer. "I think we can find reasons in everything that happens even when it's hard. You found a reason to be brave. I found a reason to fight harder. And together we found a way to help other families." Ruby smiled sleepily. "I love our story, even the scary parts." "Me too, baby," Simone whispered. "Me too." As the house settled into peaceful quiet, the Carter family slept soundly in their home, a home built not just of walls and rooms, but of unbreakable bonds, hard-won wisdom, and a love that had proven stronger than any system designed to tear it apart. They had lost each other for a time, but in finding their way back together, they had discovered that some things, the most important things, can never truly be taken away. Ruby's courage to speak truth had not only reunited her family, but had created ripples of change that would protect vulnerable families for generations to come. Sometimes, the most powerful revolutions begin with a child's simple insistence that love matters more than paperwork, and that families know their own hearts better than any stranger with a clipboard ever could. The Carter family's story became a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of listening to children's voices, and the truth that poverty should never be confused with neglect. In a world that often moves too fast to notice the quiet struggles of working families, Ruby Carter's 8-year-old voice had demanded that the system slow down, pay attention, and remember that behind every case file is a real family with real love and real dreams. And in the end, love won.